silence as weapon. Prior Ambrose barked the order, and two attendants seized Brother Thomas by the shoulders, dragging him along the cloister toward the narrow cell. Fear tightened Thomas's fingers until his nails bit the palms. He tried to speak once, a single urgent syllable, and an attendant pressed a palm over his mouth. The corridor smelled of cold wax and wet stone. The bolt slid home behind Thomas with a deliberate, final sound that announced the sentence. Within those first breaths, the central conflict was clear. The order had turned enforced silence into a tool to erase dissent, and Thomas was the instrument's newest subject. Thomas had been a postulant 3 years earlier, washing bowls and reading psalms in a voice thin from habitual restraint. Now he stood pressed against stone, stripped of his scapula, his single prayer bead replaced by a splintered wooden token. He counted the steps by the scrape of sandaled feet and the whisper of robes. He moved because he had to, not because he believed the ritual. The immediate problem was survival inside a cell designed to remove everything that told him he was a man rather than a number. That baseline fact, that silence itself was punishment, dictated every motion Thomas made from the moment the bolt shut. Prior Ambrose walked back to his study without looking over his shoulder. He walked with the ledger in mind. Ambrose's hands did not shake. He smoothed his robe, clutched the iron key ring, and returned to the ledger as if preparing an altar. At the doorway he paused to check a list of names. His pen moved in short, clean marks. Documents mattered here. The method was bureaucracy as doctrine. A timetable of hunger, a list of days to cut light, a chart of rations, a code of permitted noises. Ambrose recorded Thomas under a program heading and wrote the duration in a column with an even hand. The writing was an act of governance. An attendant hesitated at the cell threshold, and for a moment, Thomas saw a human face dimmed by guilt. The attendant set a crust of hardened bread near the far wall, and left a prayer bead wrapped in oilcloth beneath the stone lip. Thomas picked the bead up with the slow care of someone defying a rule. He put the splintered token in his robe and hid the bead in the hollow of his palm. His hands shook. He breathed as if counting invisible steps. The attendant turned away quickly when Thomas made the forbidden sign, a thumb and 2 fingers, and the sound of retreat filled the corridor. That small kindness introduced the first emotional shift. Fear loosened into a fragile hope. Ambrose's study smelled of sour linen and old wax. He sat, opened the slate, bound ledger, and set a candle so that the flame cut a precise wedge of light. He annotated, Thomas, scaffold code 3. Reduce light to none. Rations to half portion on day 7. He wrote with the same cadence as his prayers. Prior Ambrose believed his actions preserved the order. He believed that removing the distraction of speech and community would strip away sin, reveal obedience, and restore discipline. He folded doctrine into procedure. He dismissed any suggestion that the monastery's actions could be cruelty. To him these were necessary calibrations. Thomas' first week was arithmetic of absence. The small window had been sealed. There was no rim of sky, only a rectangle of stone. He felt the change of light by his body clock alone. Candleless hours that passed not by sight, but by the way his stomach collapsed and sometimes spasmed. He learned the sound of his breath in the dark. He learned the places where the stone rose warm and where it stayed damp. He kept the prayer bead between his teeth when nothing else remained. He spoke to himself once, mouthing a line from a psalm until his jaw ached, then stopped because the silence itself reasserted control. Outside, in the refectory, a novice found a torn scrap with a notation in Ambrose's hand. The scrap listed names with dates and ration codes. The novice read the names, Thomas, Marcellus, and Tony, and felt a sudden disbelief that became a question. He carried the scrap folded inside his habit and did not go directly to Ambrose. He went instead to sister-in-law. No, to a kitchen porter he trusted. The porter examined the handwriting and nodded once. The porter said, "Go to the chapel registry." The novice moved because doubt had crept past him. What had been unquestioned now required proof. Doubt became action. Thomas sensed change in the corridor. Steps that had been distant now halted before his cell. A thin voice, the novice, challenged procedure in the cloister with measured words. Prior Ambrose, what are these codes? The novice's tone held the tremor of risk. Ambrose replied in the chapter hall with a practiced calm. He did not shout. He turned the ledger for the monks to see and named the punishment an instrument of correction. Discipline is order, Ambrose, and looked past the novice's face at the gathered brothers. The novice pushed. Brother Thomas is not a number, he said. You write days against a man. Ambrose tapped the ledger with a finger. Brother Thomas transgressed communal rules. The order forbids noise in penance. The ledger records mercy, not malice, the novice said. I read the code. The rations fall before confession. That is not mercy, Ambrose answered. Orders preserve the whole, novice. Orders can be wrong, Ambrose. Then you will learn what correction costs. The exchange sharpened into a public challenge. The argument contained 5 rapid lines of speech, and each line used names to anchor who spoke. The council called for a chapter gathering. Monks filed into the stone hall with torches. Thomas was brought in for a forced penance with a rope about his wrists. He had been kept from speaking, but the strain of silence had turned his throat raw, and an internal storm pressed against the ribs. In the hall, under torchlight, the novice stood and pulled the scrap from his sleeve, flattening it on the bench, so the ink could be read by all. The ledger sat on Ambrose's lap like a judge. A hush fell. Even the torches seemed to tremble against the windless air. Thomas' mouth opened and closed until something hot rose through him. When Thomas finally broke the silence, it was not a crafted speech. He shouted a single name. Ambrose, his voice cracked and tore into the hall. That outcry was involuntary, born from hunger, fright, and the pressure of many sleepless nights. The chapter reacted, some faces hardened, some eyes averted. One novice gasped aloud. Ambrose's hand tightened on the ledger. The room shifted from ritual to confrontation. Thomas, I kept the prayer. You took the bead, he spoke in short sentences, counting breaths between lines. Prior Ambrose answered, you broke the rule. Thomas pushed back. You call it mercy and call it correction, but you marked men on lists like sheep. The exchange flicked from accusation to defense. Ambrose's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried. You would end discipline for all. Thomas' reply was a broken laugh. Discipline that kills the sense of self is not discipline. The crowd watched. The novice said, we saw the ledger back, and 4th of 3 to 6 short lines occurred between Thomas, Ambrose, and the novice, each naming one another to keep the dialogue anchored. The chapter's peak arrived when the novice spread the ledger pages and read aloud entries that specified the method and duration. He read the phrase that linked silence with shrinking rations. Hearing the schedule made the method concrete for those who had previously trusted Ambrose's hand. The revelation functioned as the climax. It turned private cruelty into recorded policy and forced the monks to choose whether to believe the ledger or the prior. The emotional pressure became a public test. Thomas' outcry cut through the pretense. The ledger's ink cut through doctrine. Some monks moved instinctively toward Ambrose in defense. Others shifted away. A senior monk demanded explanation. Ambrose clasped the ledger and, with a slow motion as if to sanctify the pages, pronounced that the measures were for the salvation of the soul. A heated exchange followed. Ambrose, said the senior monk, are men to be made silent until they are no longer recognizable. Ambrose, we correct, we do not execute, the senior monk said. Correction that erases names is close to execution. The debate included 3 to 6 rapid lines of speech and returned repeatedly to specific actions. Sealing windows, withholding bread, the ledger's entries. When the chapter ended its formal debates, it did not topple Ambrose. The assembly voted to reassign the novice and to deepen Thomas's confinement. The order protected its procedure. The emotional shift here was clear. Initial hope for accountability slid into a sobered realization that the system defended itself. The novice left the hall with his rank stripped, His hands trembled when he touched his habit. Thomas returned to the deeper cell with a smaller ration and a new schedule set down in the ledger. The public exposure had cracked the veneer of anonymity, but had not overturned the method. In the deeper cell, Thomas found his body weaker, his voice raw from the outcry. He counted the days by the way the bread changed texture and by how the damp smelled in different hours. He kept the prayer bead in his mouth. He spoke to no one because speech now carried risk beyond punishment. It could invite harsher measures. Thomas' doubt that he might be erased became a quiet resistance. He memorized the names of the men who had voted and the exact wording of Ambrose's defense. He kept those names like an inventory in his head. That inventory would become testimony later. The second emotional shift occurred here. Defiance settled into meticulous recording. A small twist followed that shifted listeners' understanding. The ledger contained an addendum in Ambrose's hand, a notation explaining why certain names were prioritized for silence. That note revealed criteria not of piety, but of control: men who questioned donations, men whose families complained, novices with voices that rallied others. The ledger showed that silence had been applied selectively. The twist changed the understanding of Ambrose's motives from spiritual correction to political maintenance. Weeks later, the novice who had been reassigned returned to the refectory to speak in the kitchen to the porter and to a sympathetic brother. He whispered details about how Ambrose balanced donations against obedience, naming specific donors whose names matched ledger entries. Those revelations reached the ears of a visiting steward who kept accounts for the diocese. The steward's arrival introduced another external event and raised the stakes beyond the cloister. The monastery's practice had consequences in the secular world. The ledger could be interpreted as embezzlement of moral authority. Ambrose sensed the change in risk. He closed the ledger carefully and pinned a new entry. Extend Thomas's schedule by 3 days. Quiet the novice with reassignment to a distant priory. He walked to the chapter door, paused, and turned the key slowly in his hand. His outward gestures were small, but they were decisions that shaped the lives of men. Those movements were his way of answering confrontation with policy. Thomas, in his deeper cell, felt both exhausted and oddly precise. He catalogued the day's rations by weight in his head and rehearsed the phrase he would speak if ever he stood in the chapter again. He practiced naming the ledger's entries in order. He resisted by making witnesses out of his memory. That survival tactic was concrete. He planned to force the ledger into a public place again. The chapter closed with control maintained, but a visible crack in the monastery's armor. Ambrose returned the ledger to its shelf and wiped the candle wax off his fingers. Thomas lay on cold stone and counted the days until the novice's possible return or the steward's decision. The final beat is not a promise. It is a decision in motion. Ambrose slid the ledger into a locked desk while Thomas swore silently to remember every line and every name. And a faint scuff outside the cell suggested a new visitor had arrived. The measures of silence. Attendant slammed the narrow cell door and tore the single candle from Brother Thomas' hand. Fear tightened Thomas' jaw. He thrust a word forward, and an attendant clamped a palm over his mouth the way they had done before. The nail marks on his palm twitched as the slab of the door settled into its iron frame. In those first seconds, the central problem was visible. The monastery did not seek blood. It sought erasure, silence, darkness, slow removal of anything that named a man. The narrator records this plainly. He notes prior movement earlier. Prior Ambrose had barked the order and 2 attendants had seized Thomas. When Thomas tried to speak once, an attendant had pressed a palm over his mouth. That earlier seizure set the pattern. Here, in the cold cell, Thomas' fear propelled his choices. He pushed his knees against the stone and tried to keep breathing shallow. The word fear appears in the record because fear shaped every motion Thomas made in the first night. He counted beats. He swallowed sounds. He tested the limits of air through gritted teeth. The cell was narrow. The attendants extinguished the candle by pinching the wick between calloused fingers. The cloth over Thomas' eyes smelled of old wax and laundry starch. He worked his lips and found only air and the taste of metal. The first shift in his feelings arrived as a raw, animal hope. He felt someone move in the corridor and thought a rescuer had come. He shifted to panic when no rescuer appeared. Then, after a measured interval, a small scrap of paper slid through the food slot. That scrap created the second emotional shift, from panic to brittle hope. A young voice had been the courier. Novice Mateo's handwriting was cramped. He wrote only 2 words. Endure this. The scrap also contained a rough tally. 2 scratches beneath Thomas's name. Thomas pressed the paper to his lips. The paper proved tangible. A human hand had chosen to risk notice. The ledger outside mattered. The ledger marked the calculus of the order. This information moved the conflict from a single punishment to evidence of system. Thomas' fear hardened into a decision to resist invisibility by any means that left no cry. Outside the cell, Prior Ambrose set his slate, bound ledger on the table, and dipped his stylus. He wrote with a strict, compact hand. He spoke to the attendant who held the ledger, and did not look at the cell as if the cell were a specimen. Record confinement. Reduced to silence and dark, Ambrose, his voice a low, clipped line of ritual. The ledger-bearer scratched the words. Attendant names and dates were followed by marks, tallies like insect bites in a margin. Ambrose's second emotional register held bureaucratic certainty. He moved from doctrinal zeal to a cold study of outcomes. He approached this as a manager examining results, not a man examining souls. Ambrose's mannerisms show in the record. He smoothed his sleeves before he wrote and indexed names with a thumb, the way a surgeon checks instruments. He removed Thomas' last personal item in a ceremonious motion, Thomas' small prayer bead, and dropped it into a cloth bag. The bead's surface was worn smooth. Thomas' reaction when that bead left him is concrete. He craned his head, made a low sound that was swallowed by the cloth, and dug his fingers at the wood of his splintered token until his nails bled. His mood shifted from brittle hope to raw anger. That anger produced an action. He struck the cell wall with a closed fist until the knuckles stung and the stone gathered dust. At the slot a novice voice came once more. Mateo had risked being seen. He whispered through the aperture, "Thomas, they keep tallies. They do not call them punishments." Thomas answered in a whisper that became air. Their exchange contained no metaphors, only facts. Tally marks, names, and a ledger that recorded a pattern. "Mateo, those marked twice do not return to choir," Thomas swallowed. He understood then that the measure of silence was not temporary humiliation. It was disappearance from the life he had known. The narration keeps its distance. It records Thomas's movements. He counted breaths aloud at first, then silently traced a number in the mildew with a fingertip. He found that counting grounded him and then made him dizzy. The cell had limited objects. A thin straw pallet, a rough blanket, a drain in one corner, a slot in the door through which bread or a ledger sheet might pass. Each object was described only where it affected decisions. The straw pallet scraped at Thomas's back and kept him from sleeping in any position that eased his jaw. The rough blanket carried the smell of other men's sweat and stopped the small scrap from moving when Thomas set it beneath the stone. Prior Ambrose returned to inspect the case 3 days later. He moved the ledger toward the lamp and read Thomas' name aloud to the attendant nearest him. "Thomas, Brother Thomas." Removed candle, reduced speech. Noted, the attendant nodded and closed the ledger. Ambrose walked to the cell doorway. He removed Thomas' token through the slot with a pair of tongs and held it up. He did not ask question. He issued instruction: from today he keeps only silence. Check weight of food. Note any sound. Ambrose's voice had a quiet, officious cadence, like someone cataloging inventory. Thomas could not answer. He pressed his palm to the slot and felt only the iron cold of the exchange. The presence of witnesses changed the dynamic. Mateo had been discovered once and reassigned. Ambrose announced the reassignment at the refectory. Mateo, your curiosity endangers practice. Ambrose. Mateo lowered his head. You are now assigned to external labor. No contact with prisoners, Mateo answered. Prior, I thought. Ambrose cut him off. Thoughts unmeasured breed disorder. Go. The rapid back and forth lasted 4 exchanges. Mateo subjections, Ambrose commands, an attendant's acknowledgement, and Mateo's forced silence. The scene functioned as punishment and demonstration. Thomas heard Mateo's name then as a thing extinguished in the corridor. The emotional shift for Thomas moved from suppressed rage to a tidal loneliness when the novice left. That loss mattered in action. Thomas scraped a narrow line across the cell stone with a splintered token. He counted the cuts. 1 for each name he remembered from the choir, 1 for the time his scullion father had pulled his hand away from a hot pan, 1 for the first hymn he had learned. He wrote in the stone with a blunt edge in a way that left tangible marks. That act, physical, measurable, was defiance. It was the seed of memory that the order could not list in a ledger. When an outside event occurred, as required by the order's narrative shape, the novice returned 2 nights later with a soaked scrap forced a decision. Mateo slid a dried leaf through the slot. It bore a line. They tally nights and meals. They test endurance. They watch when a man reaches breaking. The leaf confirmed the ledger's implication. The order treated endurance as data. One night, Thomas broke. He pulled at his bindings and made a sound that was not a prayer. He begged in a single uncontrolled syllable. That outcry produced the chapter's climax. Ambrose ordered a ritual that the attendants called a punitive rite. They would remove Thomas' last token of identity through the slot and force him to witness the unmaking. The ritual was a sequence of motions. Ambrose produced a small leather box and extracted a strip of linen wrapped around a name token. He read the line and then, in a deliberate action, drew the strip through the slot, letting Thomas touch the cloth with the tips of his fingers while the attendants held him back. The strip contained the name given to him at profession. Ambrose spoke the name and then snapped the cloth away. Thomas groped in the dark and felt only the empty air where the token had been. The ledger recorded the rite with a thin, clinical notation. The attendants noted Thomas' muted sound. The action was concrete. The moral crisis unfolded in the slot. Dialogue during the climax was terse. Prior Ambrose, this man becomes exemplar. No sound for 10 days, attendant. As you command, Prior. Thomas made a short, choking sound. Novice Mateo had been caught earlier and was not present. The back and forth between Ambrose and his attendants contained 4 short lines that conveyed commands and compliance. Thomas' action, ripping at his bindings and then ceasing when a hand crushed his fingers, created an immediate, violent reaction in the room. Mateos' reassignment, the attendant's tightened grip, Ambrose ordering tone. The narrative registers the climax as Ambrose's application of doctrine to flesh. After the punitive ritual, the order tightened. Meals were measured by weight. Light was limited to the corridor and extinguished at set hours. Attendants checked the slot thrice daily. Thomas' routine tightened into repetition. Small water, thinner bread, counting breaths, rubbing his thumb along the cavity where his prayer bead had been. His emotions shifted again, this time from anger to a slow, strategic endurance. He began to plan movements that left no trace yet preserved the knowledge of his existence. He tested the door with an improvised tool and found that the iron hinge carried a flake of rust that could be turned. He marked a new tally beneath his first scratches and, with the splintered token, carved a deeper line. An external event arrived as required. A visiting monk from an allied priory requested to observe the case. Ambrose prepared the ledger and arranged the observers. The visiting monk inspected Thomas through the slot and asked, "Why remove light rather than lash?" Ambrose answered, "We remove voice and claim conscience. The man will return purged or he will cease to claim brotherhood." The visitor nodded with an academic interest. His presence changed the stakes. The monastery's method required others to see it as effective. Thomas heard the visitor's boots recede and added another mark to his tally. Mateos' fate lingered in the corridor. The novice reassignment had been announced publicly to signal consequences. That public display tightened compliance among lower ranks. Mateo returned once more in secret. He had been reassigned to external labor but slipped into the cloister at night with a folded scrap of bread and a damp stone. Thomas, Mateo in the slot. I risked everything for this, Thomas answered with his fingers, pressing the splintered token against the slot. They exchanged 3 short lines. Mateos' apology, Thomas' question about the ledger, and Mateos' refusal to speak names aloud. That quick exchange did 2 things. It confirmed Mateos' continued loyalty, and it delivered information. Ambrose had been increasing the tally rate after a recent arrival in the order. The narration notes each line of dialogue and the physical act that accompanied it. Mateos' hands trembling, Thomas' fingers counting the seconds between words. The chapter is dense with small, external escalations. A new attendant took the slot watch and tightened the strap that kept Thomas' hands bound. A slate recorded the name of a man who had been silenced 2 seasons prior. Thomas judged time by these entries. He attempted a new action. Carving a tiny spiral inside the stone that could only be seen by running a rag along it and then tracing with a fingernail. He hid the splinter token in a crack and sealed it with a smear of bread crust. This action was deliberate, practical, and concrete. It was a physical record outside the monastery ledger. A twist arrived when Ambrose misfiled a ledger sheet. The mistake showed a hastily written notation that included the initials of a benefactor who had pressured the priory for order in the cloister. The notation suggested motive beyond holiness. The practice of enforced silence had administrative sponsors. Mateo had seen the misfiled paper when he cleaned the archive. He whispered, "There is a name linked to donations next to the tallies." This revelation changed the listener's understanding. The procedure was not purely doctrinal. It had fiscal and reputational drivers. The twist reoriented the chapter from an isolated cruelty to an institutional practice with outside reinforcement. Confrontation followed. Thomas scraped his nails under the door and shouted a single, raw word the first time in days. The cry was immediately muffled by an attendant's hand. Ambrose later wrote in the ledger, "Attempted sound." Noted penalty that short exchange, an attempted voice, a swift punishment, a ledger notation fulfilled the chapter's rule. An external event appears every 3 to 5 paragraphs. The conflict here is procedural and human. Thomas pushed and the order pushed back. Towards the end, discipline produced a small, secret rebellion. Thomas carved a small mark deeper than before and hid the splintered token within a hairline crack. He placed the token where the cell stamp would not reach it and smeared his hand across the stone so the mark would not glint under torchlight. He did this in the period between a counted meal and rostered checks. Mateo, returning once more in the dark, touched the hidden carving and left a loop of thread through the crack as confirmation that he had seen it. The 2 men did not speak, they passed evidence. This exchange closed the chapter's mini-conflict. The order had succeeded in removing light and sound, but it had not taken possession of a man's will to leave proof of self. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. At dawn the attendant slid a small loaf through the slot, and the loaf carried a smear of Mateos thread. Thomas slid his hand to the crack and felt the threads loop against the token. He pressed the token into his palm and whispered one word that no one could confirm. "Remember." The narrator notes the motion and records that Thomas then settled, breathing with the measured cadence he had practiced. The ledger outside continued its tallies. Ambrose returned to his desk and wrote a single notation. Observation continues. The chapter ends with a physical act, Thomas hiding his token and the thread looped in stone, rather than with an abstract statement. The immediate problem is resolved for now. Thomas retains a hidden proof of self while the order continues its process of erasure. The next chapter will take that hidden mark into a new conflict. Emotion root. Fear. The emotion shifts recorded here move Thomas from fear to brittle hope, to anger, to strategic endurance, and to quiet, guarded resistance. The narrator remains detached, cataloging actions and exchanges and leaving judgment to the record. The reader is left with the sound of iron, the smell of wax, and the image of a man who keeps his name by scratching it into stone. The breaking of silence. Two attendants seize Brother Thomas and drag him down the cloister as Prior Ambrose snaps in order to raise the severity of the measures. Fear is visible in Thomas's hands. His fingers tighten around the remaining prayer bead. He tries to call a name, a single vowel torn from his throat, and an attendant clamps a palm over his mouth. The corridor stone rings with quick footsteps and the scrape of rough sandals. Within those first moments the problem is clear. Thomas faces deliberate erasure of voice and person unless someone interferes. Brother Thomas is 30 paces from the lower cells when the narrator records the incident. The prior's ledger will be the proof, or the silence will be absolute. Thomas's baseline is simple. He is a novice whose presence still smells of damp linen and candle smoke, whose bones show the slow work of fasting. Prior Ambrose, wearing a slate-bound ledger at his belt, treats the ledger as if it were scripture. The conflict is concrete. Ambrose will remove Thomas's candle and ration his food on a schedule designed to stop all speech. Thomas will resist by refusing to sign any false confession. That refusal is enough to make Ambrose escalate. They arrive at the narrow cell. Attendant Marcus steadies Thomas and avoids the prior's gaze. Marcus's hands tremble as he pulls the iron bar aside and sees Thomas's face in worn candlelight. Thomas's breath comes clipped. He holds the prayer bead between thumb and forefinger and mouths. Without sound, the only phrase he keeps. A line of scripture he cannot let them erase. Marcus hears it and pauses. He has seen this man in the refectory, in the chapel, counting his rosary beads with a methodical stubbornness. Marcus pockets the splintered wooden token that slips from Thomas's habit when a strap tears. That small theft will become a decision that changes everything. In the chapter room, Ambrose places the ledger on the table and taps marginalia with a thumb. The prior speaks without raising his voice. Ambrose, the archdeacon, had warned once, but here Ambrose answers himself. We remove the light. We regulate the bread. We make silence absolute. Discipline saves the house. Ambrose's words are short and delivered with a practiced flatness. The narrator notes the ledger's margin notes, times, names, thresholds. Ambrose points to a line and says, Thomas will have 1 meal on the 9th hour and none thereafter unless he recants. An attendant inclines his head. The action is bureaucratic. The cruelty is explicit. Thomas's response is not a speech but a physical refusal. When Ambrose demands the signature, Thomas spits the quill away. The first emotion shift happens there. Thomas moves from immediate fear to a brittle defiance. Fear tightens his chest, but he refuses to let a mark on paper become his end. Marcus watches Thomas bite the quill and feels his own loyalty tilt. Marcus's hands close around the wooden token in his pocket. His face shows the recalibration of choice. Ambrose lifts the ledger and says, We leave no wound on stone. We leave no excuse for outsiders. He means the measures will appear tidy in reports. The narrator reads the ledger aloud, line by line, the camera, in the account recorded for the archive, lingering on headings. Silencing, schedules, to witnessless methods, the prior's logic is legalistic, each clause framed as preservation of order. When Thomas refuses to sign, Ambrose orders the candle removed from his cell that night and food to be cut in measured increments. They return Thomas to a deeper cell. The door closes with a slow iron scrape. Dark takes the corridor first, then the cell. Thomas sits on cold stone and presses the prayer bead to his lips. He counts aloud, a whisper so faint the wall could swallow it. His whisper is an attempt to hold identity by verb, by sound. The cell is built to remove sound. Thick walls, low arch, a single slit high for air. Thomas feels the second emotion shift. Defiance hardens into despair as deprivation begins to work. He tests his voice and finds it returning only in pinprick phrases. Day by day, the measures escalate on Ambrose's schedule. The narrator records each detail as if cataloguing evidence. The candle removed at dusk, a bowl of thin gruel at the 9th hour on alternating days, the shutter sealed at noon so light becomes a rumor. Thomas's body thins, his skin takes on a sallow hue, and his speech narrows to single words said to the prayer bead. He repeats a name, Marcus, on some nights, and the sound is a thin tether to outside. At the lower corridor, Marcus begins a private line of actions. He moves through the service passages with small decisions. Leaving a cloth hung to dry near Thomas's cell so wind will carry a faint scent of bread for 1 hour. Slipping a crumb within reach. These are concrete actions that show his shift from passive attendant to active resistor. Marcus reads the ledger lines scrawled in Ambrose's hand while folding a tablecloth in the supply alcove. The third emotion shift arrives in Marcus. Suspicion blooms into a controlled anger when he recognizes the ledger's repeated phrase. Silencing program standardized, he realizes the measures are systemic, not ad hoc. That discovery becomes his motive. Remove the ledger from the house and expose Ambrose. Marcus tests small interventions. He pockets the splintered wooden token he had taken earlier and hides it beneath his sash. He drops a scrap of bread near Thomas's threshold and watches from the shadow. Thomas, when he finds it, does not speak thanks. He simply tucks the bread under his habit and presses the token into the palm of his hand. The token connects two men through action, not through speeches, and cements Marcus's resolve. While Thomas endures, Ambrose continues to justify his plan. In one scene, Ambrose admonishes an attendant, saying, "A fast that restores order is not cruelty. We are stern because the house cannot fracture." His voice is measured. He indexes names on the ledger as if recording weather. He does not raise a hand. His cruelty is administrative. The narrator records Ambrose's small mannerisms, smoothing his sleeves, turning his face away from outcry, and treats them as documentary evidence. Thomas reaches a point where the hunger makes gestures uncertain and memory thin. He clutches his prayer bead until the skin around his knuckles shows white lines. He begins to whisper fragments of scripture and then corrects himself when a sentence lapses into a named recollection. The name of the abbess who gave him a patchwork scapular. The chant he learned in the noon office. The precise sound of the refectory bell. He uses memory as a map to anchor himself, naming actual events rather than abstract feelings. 3 nights into the enforced darkness, Thomas refuses to write a false recantation. He presses his forehead to the cold floor and says in a cracked voice, "I will not sign." The words are short, uttered with a trembling jaw. Ambrose, from the doorway, says, "Then we make the silence total." He instructs attendants to remove the slit shutter, to pile straw outside the door to deaden echoes, and to lower the ration further. The decision is administrative but concrete in effect. No light, less bread, muffled sound. Thomas's refusal produces direct punishment. As the measures deepen, Marcus finds a marginal note in Ambrose's ledger that had escaped the prior's usual index. It reads, "Protocol Level C, witness extinction, no external testimony." Archive options sealed. Marcus recognizes the legalistic phrasing from records he saw at the bishop's house years earlier. He understands that Ambrose intends to leave no living voice that contradicts the ledger. Marcus pockets the ledger note and leaves the room as if nothing happened. The discovery forces Marcus to act beyond secret crumbs. The midpoint cliffhanger occurs when Marcus slips the ledger page into his robe and is nearly caught by an attendant. The attendant extends a hand, and Marcus's fingers close quickly around the scrap. He keeps his face blank. The attendant lets go and moves on. Marcus's heart thumps against his ribs. He walks out of the chapter room with the piece of paper pressed against his sternum. The secret now exists in his body. Marcus confers with the archdeacon in the dawn hours. He speaks quietly. "Archdeacon, please, you must read this." The archdeacon takes the page and skims the marginalia. His face goes slack. He stands and says, "Bring me the ledger. Bring me Ambrose's book in full." The archdeacon's intervention is the external event that raises stakes. The archdeacon is a figure with institutional authority who can override a prior. Marcus's motive, expose Ambrose, now has an ally. They do not storm the cell immediately. The plan is deliberate. Ambrose, sensing something, comes to lock the lower door. He glances into Thomas's open slit and sees the novice crouched with the prayer bead. "Thomas," Ambrose says, "name precise. You will choose life for the order or you will be left to silence." Thomas answers only with a hiss. "I will not lie." The exchange contains 3 lines and fastens the confrontation. This is one of the required short dialogue bursts that illuminate each man. Ambrose's tone is officious. Thomas's is ragged. Marcus times the move. He tells the archdeacon the ledger is hidden in the storage alcove behind the chapel. They proceed on foot. The narrator records each step. Marcus checks for attendance. The archdeacon holds the ledger under his cloak. They move as a pair. One bearing proof, one bearing jurisdiction. The morning light is thin when they reach the threshold of the sealed lower cell. The climax begins at dawn. Ambrose stands at the cell threshold with quill in hand, ready to mark another absence. He calls to the attendants, "Seal it now." The archdeacon and Marcus arrive and force the chamber door open. The archdeacon holds the ledger aloft and thumps it on the threshold. The action is abrupt. Marcus shoves Ambrose aside. The archdeacon reads the marginalia aloud. A physical struggle erupts when Ambrose tries to snatch the ledger back. The confrontation that follows contains the required rapid back and forth. "Ambrose." The archdeacon says, "Ambrose, your hand, this is for the house." Ambrose snaps, "You have turned mercy into machinery." The archdeacon answers, "Marcus, hold him." Ambrose orders. Marcus replies, "I will not hold him." The exchange is short, sharp, and interlocked. Ambrose lashes out. An attendant steps between and is shoved aside. Thomas, half collapsed on the floor, scrabbles to his feet and holds the splintered token up with shaking fingers. He cries, "Look, this was taken." His voice is raw. The archdeacon looks at the token, then at the ledger, then at Ambrose. In the scuffle, Ambrose's cowl is tugged back and his face shows a thin vertical scar on the left cheek and the deep furrows between brows described in the records. The ledger falls open and the archdeacon reads a list of names with check marks next to them. Notes scheduling darkness and a clause marked, Protocol Level C, silence enforced. The physical evidence and Thomas's token align. A twist emerges. One of the margin notes bears the archdeacon's own seal, struck years earlier, authorizing a trial procedure Ambrose had since reinterpreted. The archdeacon's face tightens. He realizes he had once permitted a limited procedure he did not expect to become systematic. The twist reframes the earlier reliance on the archdeacon's oversight and forces a new judgment. The struggle terminates in a single decisive act. The archdeacon reads the orders aloud. He withdraws Ambrose's authority to impose special measures. He instructs attendants to remove Ambrose's key ring. Ambrose resists and grabs the ledger with both hands. Marcus steps between and twists Ambrose's arm. The prior lets go with a small sound that is neither a scream nor a prayer. The physical removal of the key ring and the ledger from Ambrose's belt is a moment of authority shifted from one hand to another. In the immediate aftermath, Thomas is dragged into a thin shaft of light. The archdeacon pronounces that Thomas will be moved to the infirmary and the ledger seized for the bishopric's records. Thomas, trembling, says, "Marcus," and presses the wooden token into Marcus's palm with a motion that reads like thanks and accusation at once. Marcus replies only, "Go. Tell them what they took." The exchange is short and concrete. Thomas's survival is official now because witnesses reach beyond the monastery walls. Ambrose is led away without his cowl. He walks with a rigid back and a mouth set to make no complaint that might be mistaken for contrition. The narrator catalogues this removal as an administrative act with moral consequence. Ambrose's measures are recorded, condemned, and the ledger is taken into daylight. The archdeacon stamps the ledger with a seal signaling an immediate inquiry. The attendants scatter. Some lower their eyes. A few cross themselves. In the final section, the narrator notes results and traces. Thomas survives but does not recover whole. He sits on a cot in the infirmary and repeats hours of chapel chant with a voice that stutters. He cannot match prior cadences. Marcus brings him a cloth and lays the token on the table. They do not trade speeches. Marcus bars his face with a small, careful nod. The archdeacon summons witnesses from outside the monastery. The ledger goes to the bishopric and copies are made. The public record will contain the ledger's marginalia and the archdeacon's note about the prior's removal. The last emotion shift is slow. Thomas moves from despair into a brittle, quiet relief that arrives as a physical slackening of his hands rather than a triumphal speech. He does not say he is saved. He arranges his habit, cleans the prayer bead, and repeats the name of the abbess who once sewed him a scapular. Marcus, in the refectory line, does not declare himself a hero. He creases the ledger page and places it in a chest for delivery. The archdeacon delivers orders to the attendants. The sealed cells must be opened, the roster reviewed, and families notified when appropriate. The narrator's closing record is precise. Ambrose's measures are documented. The ledger will stand in court as evidence. Thomas will be recognized as a living witness. He will be given food and light and staff to aid his voice. Marcus will be recommended for a minor position outside the cloister for having removed the ledger. The broken rosary is left on the cold stone where Thomas slept. A novice from the infirmary picks up the beads and lays them on the ledger as if to mark what happened. The final paragraph ties the chapter to a concrete beat. The archdeacon closes the ledger and places it under a lamp on the table, then lifts his hand and strikes the heavy hinge with a flat palm to call the room to order. Attendants move forward to inventory the cells and Ambrose's keys clink in a locked box as they are placed inside. The ledger sits open to the page that names Thomas and lists the precise schedule of silence. The door to the infirmary opens and Thomas steps forward to answer a question about his recollections, and the archdeacon says, "Speak, Thomas," as the ledger waits on the table.